Om Shanti. Change has been an eternal law of the universe. The world around us changes. I change constantly. Situations change. And yet, although we've accepted change in this way, it seems as if the last few years, 10 years, maybe 50 years, have been ones in which change has been more than at any other time in human history. Sometimes they now say that things change more in the space of 1 year than they used to change in 50 years or 100 years maybe. What is my response to the changing circumstances around me? How do I deal with these things? There are many different responses that one can have to change. Perhaps I resist change and I say everything has to continue to be the same. And of course it's not possible. Things are changing. And I have to find a way of dealing with that. Perhaps I try and ignore change and say, no, it's all as it used to be before. And that's also not true. Or perhaps I embrace change. And I recognize that as the tide is moving, as the wind is moving, I have to respond to that and move along with it. But there's another response I can have, and that is looking at everything around me. I stand still and I ask myself the question, can I actually direct change? Can I make change happen in a direction of my choice? I was very fortunate that I was able to come to this point where I could actually see what it is I could do to make things change in a positive direction. Going back to the moment that I actually started my spiritual journey, it was a very turbulent time and yet a very exciting time. Perhaps some of you recall it. It was a time in the 60s when many different things were happening within the world. People were looking for new directions. Certainly in the West, there had been a contentment and a satisfaction in terms of material development, and now it was time to look for other things to happen. Maybe personal change, maybe freedom, maybe things that were of the spiritual dimension. All of these things were now coming into focus. And at that point of time, in my own personal life, I could see a few different paths, and I hoped that I wouldn't have to make those choices immediately. And yet, destiny was such that I was pushed into a corner and I was having to make my choices. In one direction, I could see a very traditional Hindu path. I was born in India, but I'd grown up in England. My father was a very traditional Hindu, and I could see that that was one direction that I could possibly take. There was another direction, and that was the very traditional Western path, and I'd been exposed to those influences too. There was another path that seemed to be open, and that was a path that perhaps one could describe as the path of the permissive society. That was just coming up at that point in the late 60s. And another path which seemed to be one in which I could be true to my own conscience, and yet it wasn't any specified path in this way. Looking around, I had to ask myself the question, in 20 years' time, maybe 40 years' time, will I be comfortable with the decision that I've made now? Or will there be regret, maybe not even in 40 years' time, maybe after a year or 6 months? It was a situation in which there was a lot of choice, but not enough wisdom, or even not enough information with which to be able to make my choices. And again, fortune intervened. And instead of having to make my choice drastically at that point, I was able to take a little time. And I spent that time in India. India is a very ancient land with a civilization that stretches back to 5,000 years. And so the vibrations of that land are different to a place where there hasn't been very much happening until maybe 100 or 200 years ago. And so having a little time, a few months in that land, I found myself asking deeper questions than just the question of, well, what should I do today? I began to look at myself on an inner level and ask, well, what is it that is really the most important? What is it that I would like to aspire to for the future? I'd known the Brahma Kumaris since childhood. They were family friends. But at the moment when I needed answers, that was also the place that I turned to. And I heard some very interesting things. And the thing that touched me most deeply in that first intimate conversation with a Brahma Kumari who had dedicated her life to that work was the question of conscience. And perhaps she could see that this was my question. I hadn't actually put it into words in front of her. Obviously it had motivated me, but it wasn't verbalized. And she talked about how one had to be true to one's own conscience, that there could never be a human guru that one could follow, but it was my own conscience that had to be my guru, and it was this that would lead me to my destination. But even apart from ultimate destination, if I was true to my conscience, then I would be able to sleep comfortably each night with peace, with contentment, with fulfillment. And if my conscience was moving in one direction and my life was moving in another direction, there would always be a situation of conflict that was within myself. So we then talked further about the whole question of development of conscience and how there are many different influences that we come under. Society, media, education, culture, all these different things have a great impact. Is it possible? Is it feasible for the conscience to go beyond all these things and come to a state where there's total clarity? And this yogi indicated that yes, it was possible. That it was possible to go deep within the self and access that which is my own eternal identity. And coming to that awareness, it was possible to allow that being, which is the eternal being within, to actually rise up above all the limitations that this physical body or limited consciousness has imposed. And in that state, it was possible to see what I needed to do at this moment of time, and possible to see the path ahead and also the destination at the end of the path. I was fascinated, and I began to study the things that she was sharing. I'd come in the afternoons, I began to come in the mornings, I began to come mornings, afternoons and evenings. And my mind was totally enraptured by these fascinating things that I was hearing about. I was hearing answers to the questions that I had had for a long time, but I was even hearing answers to questions that I haven't even articulated at that point. One of the questions had been about God. Who, why, what, relationship. Questions that I think every human being must have had at some point in their life. And when I'd asked my Hindu friends and cousins and so forth questions about God, the answers had been very confusing for me. No doubt they spoke with sincerity, and perhaps their faith was giving them help in their situation, but it wasn't things that I personally could relate to. When I asked my Christian friends or teachers, a word that they would very often use was this word, mystery. Well, these are mysteries, and you're not actually supposed to even understand them. I had many Jewish friends, and again in the conversations with them, I found that certainly my own awareness wasn't any further clearer. And so I'd actually set aside the whole subject of God, thinking that, well, at the right time, if it's my fortune, if it's in destiny, maybe I'll find out something more. But I didn't actually give any further attention to that. And yet two things that came up within the initial conversations was so clear and had such a profound impact on my own awareness that they actually transformed the future course of my life. One was this recognition of the eternal being. I remember just before I came to the Brahma Kumaris, I'd been thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, and my choice had been a career in medicine in which I'd be able to have my own freedom and independence, but also a life in which there was service, serving of humanity in a very real way. And I came across one of the barriers, a very simple one perhaps, but one of the barriers that indicated all the different blocks that actually still existed in the world in the 60s in terms of women and the role of women. And the situation at that point was that in the London medical schools, they only kept 20% of their places for women for studying medicine. And I had a very, very deep shock about that. I had a question in my mind. Well, why is it that women are seen in such a specific way? Because I was told that, well, we invest a lot of money in training women, and then they go off and get married and they don't pick up their careers, and so it's really not worth our while investing our time and energy and money. And I'm sure there must be many other deeper reasons than this, but that was one of the things that I was quoted. But it brought up to the surface the whole question in my mind about identity, how I see myself, how others see me, whether it was possible to have equality within the world, if it was possible for a woman to actually go beyond all the disadvantages and the blocks that society placed and be able to express one's own true potential. And so just before coming to the Brahma Kumaris, that had been one of the situations that I'd encountered. And so the question of identity was a very real one for me. And in fact, before the path of spirituality, it had been not just a question, but a factor of great passion and even anger. Coming to the awareness of identity from a very different perspective, not just the physical, but an eternal perspective, brought about a significant change in the way in which I looked at myself, looked at the world, and saw my own role for the future. I realized that if I could come back to the state of my own inner dignity and maintain the awareness of my own highest spiritual identity, then this is the image that I'd be able to project to others. And whatever were the blocks that they had in their attitude and their vision would melt. Soon after I had started to follow the path of spirituality, I came across another limitation. It's interesting that prior to my spiritual journey beginning, it hadn't been a factor that I'd had to deal with. But this was soon afterwards, and I came back to London, and in the early 70s, the situation in London in terms of the makeup of the population had shifted quite drastically. There had been a huge influx of refugees come in from Africa, people from an Asian background, and now, it may have existed before, but I'd never encountered it. But now, there was a very distinct difference in terms of seeing not just a woman, but a brown skin. And it was again the understanding of my own spiritual identity and being able to maintain my own inner dignity that allowed me to rise above that particular difference. So often we say, but you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be looking at me with a vision of racism based on color. You know, how thick is the skin? It's actually perhaps only 1/16 of an inch. And yet, we base our attitudes or our responses to human beings and our reactions just on this. And under this, it's actually the same. A person shared a vision once, and they said that whatever the color of this may be, the color of our blood, our sweat and tears is actually the same. And go even deeper than that. Go deeper than the skin and the bones and the flesh and the muscles and everything else, and come to the eternal identity and see others with that vision. And there's an eternal connection, and one can instantly resonate with that and feel that just as I have hopes and desires and dreams and aspirations, this human being also has the same. When a child cries, the same things are making a child in Africa cry, or a child in Europe, or a child in India. And when a child smiles, again, the ingredients are absolutely identical. And so that first realization of my own inner identity showed me how it was possible to break free from all limitations and come back not only to a state of freedom of the self, but also in that freedom to experience and then be able to express that which is the highest potential of the self. I discovered that it was possible to actually experience a very deep state of love within my own inner being, in which I could see the whole of humanity as my family. And perhaps on one level it's easy to see the whole planet as your family and love everyone, and not so easy to actually feel the same for your neighbor with whom you're having a problem about your garden. They're not looking after their garden, maybe you want your garden to look nicer, all sorts of little things can come in. But to love that neighbor also, to see the soul as my brother, and not to mind what they've said, not to hold any pain or suffering in my heart because of the incidents that have happened, to let that dissolve, to rise up above it, and just experience pure love. I discovered it was possible. And the more I began to understand the functioning of my own mind, and where thoughts were coming from, and how thoughts could be channeled in a specific way, the more I became aware that freedom didn't mean being able to come home late at night whenever I wanted. Freedom didn't mean to be able to go wherever I wanted. Freedom actually meant to be able to create within my own consciousness the qualities that I wanted to experience and stabilize myself in that awareness. Peace and love, truth and joy. The second very deep realization that came very soon after hearing this understanding of the self was the understanding of the Supreme. And where there had been many questions, or questions that were not answered and so had been pushed to one side, I was asked to experiment with a very simple technique in meditation. To be aware of the self as the eternal being, and to think about God as light. That's all. There was no other image, no other symbol, just this understanding of God as light. And when I focused my mind on the Supreme, in this understanding of light, what I found was that beyond my own awareness, it was as if I was in the presence of the divine, and something else was reaching me and beginning to work on me and influence me. And from that experience, I had to acknowledge that there is a Supreme, that there is one who is the parent of the whole of humanity. Understanding more and more the theory, the information, but also just letting myself experiment with those ideas in terms of who God is, I found that not only was there a very real experience in which I could verify for myself that this is the truth, but I found that I was being influenced by this. I was being transformed through that relationship with the Supreme. Within a very short time, there was a very powerful motivation that came in my heart. And I began to remember my friends, the people I'd been studying with back in London, and I thought, all this has been so useful for me, I think I should share these with those people too. And so these two things came about as a double motivation in my life. One, to move forward into the depth of spirituality and my own development and understanding. And secondly, to share these things which are so valuable for me with others. And if I look at where I stand today, I'd feel that perhaps it was these two parallel things that are still with me now. And it's both these things that have shaped my life, but also have taught me so much and allowed me to develop and grow. And so truly it's been a path which has been a journey, an education, but it has been a path which has shown me many, many different things, both about the spiritual dimension and also the reality of the physical dimension and the marriage of both these things. One particular example of this is how my own personal journey was the discovery of peace within, but also seeing how covering that peace, there are so many other things that interfere. Until I was in my early 20s, I don't think I'd actually understood what is anger. I don't think I'd actually even experienced it to any great extent. Finding that inner peace, and then having to deal with the paradox that anger is very much part of me, and I can't deny it. It is here. How am I going to deal with it? What am I going to do with it? Was my own personal growth. But together with that, because there was also the life of service, and anger meant that the people I was working with, the people I was communicating with, were being exposed to this. It was actually being in that situation of service and learning to cooperate with others that was the most powerful motivation for me to deal with my own inner stuff. I know that all of us actually are brought onto a path which is right for each one of us individually. We may all be on different paths, but we're on the path which is right for us. And for me, if it had been a path in which it was just self-exploration, examination, and trying to transform the self just on the basis of meditation and silence and solitude, my mind would have been very bored with that, I think, and perhaps I would have run off doing other things. But my good fortune was that, yes, there was the awareness of the inner journey, but I was very much involved with all the external things of service and the activities. And it was through that there was a sense of motivation and responsibility to actually bring about very deep changes within the self. For example, a question that was put to me when I would say, but there's bound to be anger if somebody is taking responsibility and they're not fulfilling it. If things are not happening in the right way, if somebody has made a commitment and they're not fulfilling it, of course there's going to be anger. And I was very sweetly made aware by a senior yogi that, well, that's fine. If I wanted, I could get angry, but what I would be doing then is to cut off cooperation from others. Would I be able to do everything on my own? Would I be able to achieve even 1% of what was being done if it was my responsibility alone without the cooperation of everyone? And I had to stop and think. And of course, the answer was very obvious. There was no way in which one individual could do anything or everything. It had to be through a team spirit. It had to be through cooperation. And so it meant letting go of anger. It meant letting go of something else that is very, very deep within every human psyche, and that is ego. The scriptures of India have a very interesting image. The whole story in the scriptures is a very long one, but I'll just share the image. They say that when it was time for evil to be conquered by the power of goodness, there was a monkey who had this task, who was going to fulfill this duty. And he had a very long tail. Well, monkeys generally do. But the point was that this tail of the monkey, that the monkey couldn't see, was his own ego. And so in our own personal journey, and in the struggle and the tug of war between the negative and the positive and the good and the evil within the self, the way that one deals with this is through God's love, God's help, God's strength. But the ultimate victory has to be the victory over my own ego. And ego is a long, long tail that we all carry. You know, it's behind us, so we can't see it, but it's there nonetheless. And not even just the whole process of meditation and realization, but actually working with many others in many different ways, taught me the absolute need to be able to deal with this and inculcate love and respect and humility. I've been sharing things in terms of my own personal inner journey, and yes, service activities that taught me a great deal. I'd like to just relate these things now in terms of the things that are happening out there, and how, as we change, we're able to make the world change also. Perhaps it seems to be a statement that's very grand, to think that if I change, the world can change too. And yet if we look at it on a very deep level, we're able to see how each one of us influences things around us. There's a statement that says, when I lift my finger, I move the stars. There's an impact that we have which is very far-reaching and extended, if only we care to realize it and appreciate it. In terms of just this aspect of peace and transformation within the self and getting rid of anger and so on, in 1986, we were involved in a project that was described as the Million Minutes of Peace Appeal. And this was asking people to share something very precious. We weren't asking people for money. We were asking people to donate time, their thoughts of prayer, of meditation, of contemplation, good wishes, good thoughts. And that was the International Year of Peace. And in January, when we first suggested this project of sharing thoughts of peace and inner peace, bringing peace in the world, it was considered not only an unusual idea, it was actually an idea that wasn't very easily accepted. It was the year in which people were saying, we have to fight for peace. And I'd smile, because my question would be, if I'm fighting for anything, whatever it may be, is it actually going to be possible to have peace at the end of the journey? If my journey and my path is a fight, what's going to be the destination? It's been stated in the Charter of the United Nations that wars begin in the minds of men. The converse must also be true, that peace begins in the hearts of human beings. And so we were asking people to share thoughts of peace, to allow peace to come back within their hearts. By the end of the year, nobody was questioning this. Somehow, the atmosphere of the world, the right time, visible recognition of the power of spirituality, all of these things had happened. And in fact, this project became the largest non-fundraising project and reached 88 countries. And we received 7 Peace Messenger Awards from the UN. And so I was beginning to see how, on the one hand, it was an inner spiritual journey. On the other hand, it was a journey with many, many others with the same motives, the same goals, the same destinations. And that was a step forward for my own realization in a very, very major way, that it isn't one individual who's going to move forward to perfection. It's going to be the whole world that's going to evolve, and we're going to move forward together. The vision that started the spiritual university, that has always inspired me, has been the vision of the founder. What he saw was the whole world going through a state of turbulence and chaos and upheaval, huge, huge disasters, and yet the world becoming very quiet and silent and still. And in that world, it was as if stars were coming from another dimension and entering the physical arena. And as they came into the world of matter, these stars took on a human form. And although they were human, they were divine. These stars, as they took on their form, became beings that radiated light. Light shone from their forehead, light shone from their eyes, and it was as if there was a light inside that was emerging. When they communicated, it was as if there was a silent communication that reached each other. When they needed to speak, it wasn't just words, it was poetry. When they moved, it wasn't just a movement, it was a dance. It was a world in which the highest qualities were visible and were being expressed in interaction and relationships. It wasn't a world somewhere up there in imagination. It was very much a world here in reality, in the physical domain. But everything within that world had come back to a state of order, of perfection. And the motivation of the founder was, now that's the world that has to be created. And each one of us has to become an instrument to make that world happen. And so when I was seeing that people were now acknowledging that we as human beings were responsible to make peace take place, happen in the world, I was seeing the beginning of the realization of that vision. Another very deep learning for me personally was in the next project that we undertook, and that was Global Cooperation for a Better World. And within that, we were asking people to share their visions of a better world. And they were talking about values. They talked about truth, about love, about justice, about harmony, about health. They didn't want physical things of the material world. They didn't want bigger cars or bigger houses or things like this. They were talking about values. And I began to notice that there was a shifting of the pendulum, where values had been rejected a little while earlier. We'd come to such a crisis in the world that people are now saying that values are what is required. Values are needed. Being involved in the international coordination of that was again a whole process of learning for me personally, apart from the huge amount of energy that was generated and success that came through the project. But what I personally learned within all of that was, sitting in an office in London, it would have been very easy to say, well, this is the way things should be. This is the way things have to be done. And we very quickly learned that it isn't possible to say that this is the only way to do something. It's like if there's a diamond, there's many facets, and each facet is reflecting light beautifully. And none of those facets are not right. Every facet has its own truth. And so at that moment, again, the humility of learning, it isn't only one that is right. Many, many, many can be right altogether. And so letting go of, again, old habits and traditions was a very beautiful lesson to learn at that moment. But moving on from there, at this point of time, I see that as I hold my own vision of my own personal destination, but I also see ahead of myself the vision of a better world in front of me. This is something that's happening, again, not only to me, but I'm seeing how many are being touched. It's a season for change, a season for rapid transformation. It's a time in which people are beginning to feel that darkness is ending, light is coming. In terms of my own personal transformation, perhaps the thing that I've had to develop and work on more intensely than anything else has been to have faith in myself. From the moment of knowing God and experiencing God's love, to have faith in God was very simple. To have faith in destiny has also been an interesting journey. To know that every moment has significance, is right, is accurate, is beneficial, and is carrying me forward. That has been not always sweet lessons, but sometimes difficult lessons to learn. But in particular, to have faith in the self. To know that although I'm seeing my weaknesses and negativity, yet what God is seeing within me is my original perfect state. And if I hold on to that vision, I'm able to keep God's vision on me, and I'm able to move forward and fulfill that vision. But I believe that this is true of every human being, that each and every one of us in our original state has total purity and truth. I can have this faith for each and everyone else when I have this faith in myself. If I don't have this faith for myself, it's not possible to have it for others. But having this faith means I see it in others too. I'm seeing how, as we understand these things and come back to the original understanding of who human beings are, that we are actually divine, and we begin to follow those qualities and values in our lives, all the chaos of the world around us, which actually has been generated by us, can all be resolved. We can sort it all out. Whether it's the breakdown of the ecosystem, whether it's the situation of war and conflict in every land, in every corner, whether it's the breaking down of the family structures, all these things are resolved not by trying to deal with the problems out there. We've been trying to do this and it hasn't worked. But as I begin to use the power of silence and love myself, respect myself, I'm able to love and respect not only the people around me, or not only people within the world at large. I'm able to extend that love and respect to the world, to nature, to the environment. And so I see how definitely through changes within the self, we're going to be able to influence changes out there and make things move in the direction of our choice. We have choice. It isn't that circumstances are going to move according to another force that's working. God's desire is that a better world should come. Our desire is that a better world should come. And as both these energies come together, time will reveal that scene in which there is definitely a better world ahead. I'm aware of the power of thought and the power of meditation. What I'd like to do is to invite you to join me for a few minutes in meditation in which we move towards that better world. Even if you've never meditated before, it's fine. In fact, all of us meditate. We don't always put a label on it, but we do. And so all it is focusing your mind in a specific direction. Let's try it. Sitting quietly, turning inwards, I emerge the awareness of the peace that is within me. In the awareness of peace, I enter the presence of the Supreme, the being of infinite light and love. I fill myself with this light, and I see this light touch the hearts of human beings everywhere. I see God's light touching nature and the world around me. God's light influences the universe, and we move towards a world of light and a world of love. I know that as I focus on that which is the highest within myself and have the awareness of sharing that and projecting that, I'm linking up with many others who are aware of these energies and secrets, and together we actually create that better world. Om Shanti.